RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
Hello, everyone. I am Matthew Volm, co-host of RevOpsAF, the podcast, and CEO and founder of RevOps Co-op, a global community of 15,000 plus revenue operators from all across the globe. And today we are talking hiring Moneyball and sitting down with Jeremey Donovan, who is an operating advisor to the Insight portfolio companies. Jeremey, welcome, my friend. I would love to first turn it over to you before we get into all the hiring Moneyball stuff, and just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your current role at Insight, because I think it's a bit unique as a operating advisor, and then just your career path, how you've navigated and got into revenue operations and where you are today.
I'll try to be super brief because I'm old and it's a long path. So at least in the current role, yes, as you described, I'm currently an operating advisor to some of Insight's portfolio companies. We're about $80 billion of assets under management, over 500 portfolio companies. I work with companies on their revenue strategy, in particular companies who are scaling from 10 to 100 million in ARR. All of our portfolio companies are B2B software companies, so I'm really focused there. I don't consider myself an investor. I very much consider myself an advisor. How I got here is pretty circuitous. The line starts with being a semiconductor engineer way back when, and then ultimately ends here. I would say it's been about a decade in sales/revenue operations now, and it's been the most fun part of my career because it brought together a lot of interests, and I just find it incredibly intellectually interesting because I can apply a lot of that, like math, statistics, computer science, analytical rigor and RevOps, right? I think you had a prior guest talk about defining RevOps in various ways, but it's the strategy piece, people, process, and technology. So you can really bring to bear a lot of thinking and skills on all of those. So that's the path. The LinkedIn probably tells the full path, but it's a little bit winding and circuitous.
No, I love that. But the thing that is obviously unique about your story is something I see consistently across a lot of folks who have navigated up into revenue operations as a career path, which is you start somewhere typically very unique. So you mentioned semiconductor engineering, talked to a CRO the other week who started as a software engineer, and then actually talked to a director of RevOps a few weeks prior who started as a geologist after undergrad. And so it's always fun to hear where people started their professional journeys and kind of how they wound up into RevOps. I think because a lot of people there are naturally curious, they have this winding route there, but it actually serves them very well, sets you up for success in revenue operations, given the flurry of new, unique challenges and things that you'll be faced with as a revenue operator every day.
Intentionally or unintentionally, it very much plays to the theme of our conversation today because that's testable, right? I think there's a lot of hypotheses like, should RevOps people have come from consulting? Should they have STEM degrees? Should they have worked in engineering? Should they have computer science backgrounds? All these things are now more than ever testable things. And it's not going to tell you with 100% certainty whether somebody is going to be successful if you hire them into a role. But if you're hiring and you're trying to decide between two candidates who are otherwise identical, or for larger companies, if they're hiring certain roles at scale, then it does matter, right? If you can get a few percentage points edge on the likelihood that someone's going to be successful.
Yeah, 100%. I brought up the topic and the theme, hiring Moneyball, as what we're going to talk about today. I'm a baseball fan. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know if I've seen the movie, Moneyball, the movie. Maybe that'll be my holiday break. One of the things I need to add to that list. For those who are listening who either maybe don't know, I've never heard the term Moneyball before, or maybe they have, let's give everybody a refresher or at least a clean slate in terms of a starting point. Talk a little bit about what is Moneyball, and then we'll get into some of the work you've done with that before with CROs.
Yeah, so unlike you, I'm not a sports fan. I'm a sports ball person. Even though I played basketball in high school, that was pretty much the beginning and the end of my interest and career. I did see the movie. I didn't read the book, although and I'm a voracious reader, so I guess I got to go back and read the book. But the concept of Moneyball is that you can stack the odds in your favor by optimizing the talent around a goal. In the case of baseball, at the end of the day, you want to win most number of games, right? The highest winning percentage. And you can then build statistical models to figure out what's going to drive wins. And again, I'm not a baseball person, but let's say that's on base percentage. Then you can figure out who are the people that are going to maximize your on base percentage in the service of maximizing the number of wins. You relate this over to hiring, it's the same kind of question. At the end of the day, let's say you're hiring for account executives, right? You want account executives who are going to meet or exceed quota consistently. So what can you understand about people in order to ensure that they're more likely to meet or exceed quota? And there are some things that are easy to know, and there's some things that are hard to know. Easier to know things are things that you could scrape from a LinkedIn profile. Where did they work before? How long? What was their tenure? Where did they go to school, if that mattered or not? Did they work for companies that were similar size, similar sales motion, like these kinds of things? And then it definitely gets harder. Once you are talking to candidates, there's other data that you could collect. Maybe you give them an IQ test, maybe you give them a personality test, right? So it's really any data that you can use to get an edge. And I'll reinforce that it's like, maybe somebody has a few percentage points higher likelihood of success by having certain biographical data markers or personality traits or IQ. It's not a guarantee, because obviously there's so much else going on in the statistics and social sciences world. They would call it idiosyncratic, right? There just can't be otherwise be known or controlled for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think at least Moneyball, as we were talking about it as it related to sports and baseball, it was, I think it was early 2000s. It was the Oakland A's who had a baseball team and had a third of the budget for a roster as everybody else. And so they were looking at how to assemble a group of people around a goal to win, right? To win with limited resources and budget. And so they had to do something that other teams were not doing. And they took this very statistical approach to analyzing talent. Like you said, getting that group of people with the right skill sets around them to help them win, and ended up being successful. And so I know you've done some work in this world as it relates to CROs, and I think I've seen some stuff on account executives and people on the sales team. So talk a little bit about some of the findings and the work that you've done and some of those things that you've learned about what are those traits, right? Maybe that are relevant and not relevant. And I'm sure there's a bunch of surprises that are in there too.
Yeah, for sure. So the ones I've done in depth, I've done SDRs in depth, and then I've done the opposite end of the spectrum, which is CROs, and I've done a little bit on enterprise account executives. So I'll start with, how do you determine success? And if you're pulling profiles off LinkedIn, you can't really know what their quota attainment was. What you do know is how long they lasted in the job. On the SDR study, we did the study at my former employer, which was SalesLoft. They're a sales tech company and an insight portfolio company. In that case, we were hiring very rapidly, and we wanted to make sure, right, that we were gaining, again, like that little edge in hiring. So we pulled profiles of about 1,500 prior SDRs off LinkedIn and standardized, normalized the data to figure out, like, prior work experience, college degree. What should you hire SDRs right out of college, or should you hire SDRs who were in a couple of years? And our success criteria was that, again, they lasted 2 years in the job or got promoted. Having pulled that data, we found there was a magic profile for the role at the time. They had about 2 to 3 years prior work experience, and they came from professional services, but really specifically, they worked in a recruiting agency as a recruiter. So that turned out to be our golden profile. It didn't mean it was the only profile we went after, but when we came across those people, we were also positively predisposed because we knew that those were statistically more likely to make it. But we hired other people. I remember we hired a bartender, a person who worked for the Ritz-Carlton. We hired all kinds of people from all different walks of life, a former attorney who wanted to get into B2B sales. It was a pretty big range. So that was the golden profile. We also looked at other things that people think matter. So one of the ones a lot of people think matters in sales hiring is whether they played sports in college. And
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, and I don't believe anything until I've seen good data work that other people have done, because I do have a stats background,
Yeah.
or I've done the work myself, and I couldn't find anything like this. So it turned out for SDRs that overall sports did not matter, but if you were to separate sports into individual sports like swimming, gymnastics, golf, tennis versus team sports, volleyball, soccer, basketball, field hockey, people who had individual sports backgrounds were more likely to be successful as SDRs. But team sports in that particular case was not correlated with success. And then the last one I'll add in there on the SDR study, which is not really going to come as a surprise, is that college rank, right? We looked at if you were in a top 10 or top 20 school versus school number 150 on the US News and World Report's list, that statistically did not correlate with success. I think that's not a surprise, and not just in SDR hiring, but also in hiring in general, that where you go is not who you'll be. There's actually a book by that title. That's a quite good book. I remember when our kids were little.
Yeah, that's great. So with sales development reps, you said the golden profile, it sounded like 2 to 3 years of prior work experience. Recruiting agency was the best sort of background. And then I know you said the college or university ranking didn't matter. Did whether or not you attended higher education matter or impactful?
Most in the study, what we did look at was college degree, like what was their major, I should say. The only major that mattered was STEM, science, technology, engineering, or math, which is, I'll come back to why that is, why that mattered. But the bigger comment is that there aren't enough of them, right? Not enough STEM people go into sales. If that would be part of the golden profile, there just aren't enough of them. Why does that matter? These things are often proxies for something else. In academic job performance circles, a famous study by Hunter and Schmidt from 20, 30 years ago looked at a meta-analysis of other studies and found 3 factors most predictive of job performance. 1 is IQ, 2 is conscientiousness, and 3 is like actual testable job skill. And in the case of STEM, right, there is a statistical correlation of marginally higher IQ if you're in STEM versus other degrees progressively. And it's not to say that there aren't even higher IQ people who are in sociology or the humanities, but the median IQ is a few points higher typically. It's correlation, not causation, but it may be part of what the draw is to STEM. So because those people come in with that inbuilt advantage, I suspect that's what's going on.
And for SDRs and the work you did there, was there anything surprising that went against the assumptions people have? Like you mentioned the sports thing already, but anything else that maybe initial reactions that people have or think as they look to hire folks in an SDR role that were not supported?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was some of the stuff I talked about. We did look at what some of their prior roles were. There are things that might correlate with success, but there are things that might contraindicate success. Okay. One of the interesting ones was if you were to take someone who was a CSM and move them into an SDR role, there was a significant negative for doing that. So again, could there be CSMs who on a one-off basis who thrive in as SDRs or in sales? Absolutely. But if you're hiring a lot of them, that's not a pool to draw from. Marketing is fine. Product is fine. In fact, I'd almost argue product is, we didn't look at that close enough, but I would bet that one is highly correlated with success.
Yeah, that's interesting. So 2 to 3 years professional background, prior work at a recruiting agency is great, like green light, golden profile, like you mentioned. Pulling from customer success, probably not going to be the first place that one should start as they look to build out their sales development team.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I know you've done some work with account executives and sales folks as well. So tell us a little bit about some of the studies that you've ran for salespeople and some of the things that you've learned there.
Transitioning through that, I haven't gone as deep on AEs. I'll talk a little bit about what I've done, but I'll go up to CROs after that. On enterprise AEs, which is the pool that's in my head anyway, there it did turn out that prior sports participation was statistically correlated with, again, success being 2+ years in the role. So there it mattered more. And I think these things are explainable in hindsight. Being a successful SDR is a relatively individual job, whereas no enterprise deal is sold solo, or almost no enterprise deal is sold solo. You're really a project manager orchestrating an outcome. The team sports thing kicks in. Sports is a proxy for, grit and whatever the facets of grit are. So that I think totally does make sense. Introversion, extroversion is a very interesting question. I don't have the perfect answer to that, but certain things could be proxies for extroversion. For example, were you in a fraternity or sorority? And for that one, I think it was slightly correlated with success. So maybe in the interest of time, I'll move on to the CRO. And that's where things get fascinating. This one, I just did the study, way more sophisticated than the ones I've done historically. And I'm just going to stick with the sports theme for a second. For CROs, it doesn't matter whether you played sports. And I guess that also makes sense. It's been so long, and whether that's relevant for people who have become first line, second line, third line plus managers. It's a different kind of a skill set entirely from the things that you do on a day-to-day. I mean, there's almost a degree of substitutability in leadership when you move cross-functionally. I've experienced that myself because I've led all kinds of different functions in my career. And I found that as a second line plus manager, it's really about people and performance management to OKRs and objectives, right? Like budgeting. There's a certain set of cross skill sets. Some of those characteristics are going to be different. For CROs, the thing that actually matters the most, which I think is probably going to be largely true in a lot of other roles, is your prior tenure. How long were you in your last job? So that basically says that job hopping in the case of CROs is quite negative. And it's correlation, not causation, but this thing applies to a lot of roles. One of my favorite HR and performance related books is a book called Work Rules by Laszlo Bock. He was the head of HR at Google, ex-McKinsey, very analytical. He referred me to a Harvard professor who studies this for a living, a guy named Boris Groysberg. I talked to Boris last Friday. He confirmed that prior tenure matters a lot. There's also this concept of, were you promoted multiple times in a short hurry? This is not Boris. This is actually Matt, and I'm forgetting his last name, who's the CRO at Rippling. One of his hypotheses, which I think is correct, is a history of promotions, rapid promotions in your past job. It makes sense. These are the cream of the crop people who manage to thrive in a hyper-growth environment.
When you talk about tenure and job hopping, I was curious. So it sounds like you're referring to maybe switching company to company, but not necessarily taking different roles within one company prior.
Yeah, different roles within the company is awesome. But yeah, company to company is where the problem is. The surprising things on the CRO side, by the way, were, I mean, in our job, right, I interview a lot of CROs for our portfolio companies. We're generally looking for been there, done that, right? Like same industry, same size, same sales motion, right? As much similarity as possible. Interestingly, in this data, having immediately worked in the same vertical and even sub-vertical, because for me, a vertical is like fintech as opposed to HR tech, as opposed to GTM tech. So having worked in the same tech is not statistically correlated with success as defined by 2+ years in a role. The one that's interesting is the size. The only thing that seems to be not good is if you go from a really big company, like a 10,000 person plus company, to a very early stage startup, that tends to not work. And I'm not surprised, but I think my general rule of thumb is moving 2 shades is hard in either direction. So if you're at 2 orders of magnitude, right? So if you're at a 1 to 10 person company, it's fine to go to a 10 to 100. It's going to be a lot harder in the 10 to 1,000, right? It's like that 2 shades or vice versa. I don't have good data to support that, but that's kind of my current hypothesis.
Was there anything in the CRO research you did about types of roles or jobs that people had before, specifically even as we think about people in revenue operations and their own career paths and trajectory, whether CRO is a potential role or career path for people in RevOps, right? Going from, say, VP of RevOps to SVP of RevOps to a Chief Revenue Officer role. Do you have any data points on the background or the types of roles where CROs came from, where they were most successful,
Yeah,
least successful?
it's on my list of things to do, and I have the data to do it. I just haven't run it, but I'll talk qualitatively because someone asked me this recently. Someone made the statement that like the future CRO came from RevOps, and just like all things, it depends, but it depends in a way that's definable on a decision tree. I don't think that's necessarily like the new normal. I think that's hyperbolic to say that's the new normal. I think the RevOps profile into CRO is suitable in a hyper transactional business, right? Like in the PLG and hyper transactional world where the deal sizes are not huge. I think that's feasible. Citing that another podcast I listened to with that CRO of Rippling, like he made the statement that as he moved up, and he was a seller before, not a RevOps person, but he made the statement that as you move up into $100 million plus companies, especially they're much more transactional, you really are all about operations and planning, right? But in many companies, the CRO is still the chief deal maker, right? And sometimes even the CEO, right? So at Salesforce, Benioff is very proud that he is still very much out there. As the company gets bigger, the deal sizes that you work on get bigger and bigger, right? So maybe Benioff's only working on $100 million plus deals now, but there was a time where that was 10 million plus, and there was a time that was a million plus, and there was a time that was 100K plus, right? If you have an enterprise motion to the business, I don't think RevOps is a suitable background. But if you don't, and you're running a machine, and you don't need to get involved at the deal level, then absolutely, I think it's a suitable background.
Yeah, because I know we've done a lot of different events lately. One of them was this RevOps Executive Think Tank series where we had 4 different in-person events around the country. We got about 15 to 20 people in RevOps, director level and above, to attend these sessions. We asked some of those questions, and it was funny. We got very different opinions from city to city, which I thought was unique. Some people felt like even if you wanted to move into the RevOps leadership role, that you needed to have prior experience, quote unquote, holding a bag or like a
sales,
quota.
testable. Yeah, it's actually one of the things I'm eager to test.
Yeah. And other people didn't bring up prior background as either a seller or frontline, like a CSM or sales or marketing. So I'll be very curious to see some of the data.
My hypothesis on RevOps is like if I had to choose, and these probably are very different career paths between consulting finance background as opposed to a carrying the bag background and going into RevOps, my guess is you're more likely to be successful in RevOps with the finance consulting background. It's just like having done the job and knowing the skill set. The carrying the bag was not as critical. The thing that I think is different might be enablement, right? Like in enablement, having carried a bag, probably you have a different level of understanding and empathy. But in RevOps leadership, it's much more like process, systems. It strikes me as just less relevant.
Yeah, I know I might be biased because that's my background as well, as like finance, accounting, consulting. But I think the thing when you're in RevOps with that sort of background that you're well positioned for is being able to tie everything from like the activities that your team is performing on any given day all the way to how those manifest themselves on a financial statement and move from input to output or output back to input, like in one stream of thought. For a lot of people, that's hard to do, but I think that's part of the breadth of the role of RevOps. I think that background that you just mentioned sets you up well, but it's not the only one that'll get you there.
It's Moneyball-style. You're more likely to be, I think you're more likely to be successful in RevOps with a finance or consulting background than carrying a bag. Partly like there's this thing of, well, if you were a rep and had a STEM background, then sure. But the vast majority of salespeople have either some sort of a business degree or a humanities degree. And if they did a decent amount of economics and they understand math, then sure.
Yeah. And So we talked about some of the characteristics from sales development reps to account executives up to CROs. Tell us a little bit about, from your opinion or perspective, why is that important for people in RevOps? Why should people in RevOps care about hiring best practices across those different teams, and how can they best support their own companies in making better hiring?
Yeah, it'll sound obvious when I say it, but right at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to put the right inputs into the system than it is to tune those inputs to be effective. Hiring is really important. When I was in RevOps functions, it was never my initial mandate. No one expected me to get involved in hiring. Yet I was always very involved in hiring because it made my job a lot easier to get the right people in the door. So it is about getting the right people in the door. So my encouragement is, if you're a RevOps person and hiring isn't one of your critical pillars about like who you hire, how you hire, that stuff may have more of an impact on the performance of your company than like anything, not anything, but most other things that you do in the RevOps function. I would encourage people to look at who their top performers are, figure out what their backgrounds are, what's the DNA of those people, and not only try to find it via LinkedIn, but how do you test for the traits those folks exhibit? It is both your top performers and the people who don't work out. A lot of times people just look at the top performers, but the key is to look at the delta between the top performers and the bottom performers and figure out what the top people are, their behaviors, their backgrounds, and whatever. That is not true of the bottom people.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like you said, every revenue operator out there has their operating model for the company that they're working at, right? You have inputs that go into the model. They are typically people that are meant to produce certain results. And so, to your point, think about the fact that you need the right type of people to produce those results. And if you put the wrong butt in a seat and you spend, like you said, 3 months, 6 months trying to fine tune what's there, only to realize that they're not going to be able to perform at the level that you need them to, keep moving that further up front. If you make a better decision at the very beginning, maybe invest some extra time, maybe you as a revenue operator insert yourself into the hiring process. You start to analyze some of the data about the people that you're running through your interview process. These are all ways that you can best set your company and your teams up for success to drive the outcomes that you ultimately want.
Yeah, 100%.
And so I got one more question for you. It's not RevOps related. So before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about fly fishing. I know you're a big angler, but then you also dropped the fact that if there's two things you could maybe talk about, it would be cats and fishing. And so I'm going to ask you actually a cats related question. So first off, do you have a cat, multiple cats? Tell us, how many cats do you have?
Well, I have a cat on my lap right now, a kitten. So we just acquired our fourth cat. So somebody once asked me, "Are you a watch person?" And I said, "What's a watch person?" They said, "Anyone who has 3 or more watches." So I think it applies to cats too. If you've got 3 or more cats, you're a cat person.
All right. So here's my cat related, non-RevOps related question for you, which is, what's the most unique thing you've ever purchased for a cat of yours? Like, I'm thinking like costumes, a mask, like
we've definitely done. Yeah, we've done all the stupid cat purchases. So we do have costumes. Only one of the cats allows us to put the costume on, but the pet costumes are outrageously cute. I think I'll also say just the most practical thing is a laser pointer.
Yeah.
It's not outrageous, but I think it's the most fun thing. I think the best cat toy that exists is a laser pointer.
Yeah.
It's simple.
I was talking to 2 friends of mine the other day. One is a cat person, the other is not. And the one who is not said that he was scrolling through Instagram and saw this thing for a Batman mask that you would put on your cat. So it was Catman, right? And he was like, I saw it and I immediately thought of you, this other person who's a cat person. He's like, but I didn't want to click on it and send it to you because then I just knew that my Instagram feed was going to blow up nonstop with these things, but he did it anyways. And now he's like, my Instagram feed is just cats. It's cat stuff, like cat clothing.
You asked the most ridiculous thing I purchased. The 2 most ridiculous things I've seen is a different answer. The second most ridiculous, and I'll get to the first, it's not super ridiculous, is a cat backpack, which I think is outrageous. I've never seen one in it's funny, like, and cute. I guess if I were traveling, maybe that would be a thing.
Take your cat fly fishing with you.
Yeah, exactly. They would sort of love and hate that. The most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, it did show up. It was probably in a feed or something like that. You can buy this brush, but it's a tongue. So you can basically chomp down on this thing. It's a tongue. So you can lick your cat as if you're another cat. I got a good laugh out of that one, but I was not going to spend my money on that. It's a little bit too too far down.
All right. Well, if Hillary or anyone else from the Insight team is listening to this, you know what you need to get Jeremey for either his holiday gift, his birthday, or just a random present. I think the cat tongue brush so that he can lick and brush one of his 4 cats is a definite winner.
Yeah, and here's a gratuitous kitten appearance.
There you go.
Sleeping kitten.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremey. Everything from cats to Moneyball, SDRs, AEs, CROs, and everything in between, and why it's important to RevOps. Thank you for joining, for dropping some knowledge on us. That's all I got for you today, my friend, but thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.